Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. This is our fourth podcast for our third week of our course, History, Morality, and Ethics in the 19th Century American West, Red Dead Redemption 2. My identity has not changed. I'm still Rob Beyer, and my colleague and co-worker and co-author, co-producer, co-teacher, co-pedagogical scholar
is still Dan McClure.
That's right. So we're going to talk today, we're going to continue our discussion of history as drawn from our textbook, West from Appomattox by Heather Cox Richardson, along with a number of other sources that Dr. McClure has adduced. And then we will talk in our section after that on our ethics discussion, which this week we're looking at Deontology, in particular Kantian, the Kant's ethics. And we'll also look at feminist ethics, and then we'll finish by talking briefly about a couple of the essays from our other collection, Red Dead Redemption, History, Myth, and Violence in the Video Game West, edited by John Wills and Esther Wright. So without further ado, please get us started, Dr. McClure.
All right, so Richardson sort of brings the book in for a landing, right beginning in Chapter 8 with the Chicago's World's Fair 1893. In many ways, this event, this is one of those historical moments that's worth a class in itself. But we'll just briefly go through what it means or what it meant. One of the important things for historians, at least, about the Chicago World's Fair is the address by Frederick Jackson Turner. And when he put forth his frontier thesis, which is sort of the baseline of the history of the West, right? You always have to start with Turner. But Turner's thesis, more or less, was this idea that when European civilization encountered the American environment, it created a new, unique American individualism. And that's what created, quote, Americans, is this encounter between European civilization and the American environment. At the same time, he cites that the 1890 census basically said that the frontier was closed, right? And so it's the first time in the history of the U.S. where they basically said it's not like you can just go west anymore. You can theoretically, but this, quote, free land is no longer there. And this sort of set off a little bit of anxiety. I mean, this is obviously brewing throughout the whole period, but it's kind of in everyone's face, the idea that the frontier's gone. What would become of the nation now that its frontier was no longer this thing, right? Because if Americans are defined by this encounter, a European encounter with the American environment, what happens when that's no longer there? There's obvious implications to Turner's thesis where ideas about free land and frontier erased Native Americans. It's sort of that debate. Do you define people moving west into Native American territory as settlers or invaders? Right. Mm-hmm. But sure. Nonetheless, you can always kind of tease out the idea that, and I would argue that the violence itself, the displacement, the massacres, all those, the wars, that was what, in a way he's right. That's what made Americans Americans, right? Like that's a part of the baggage that comes with
being an American.
Yeah. And you see the frontier, right? Like, we still have it in the military. The Chinook helicopter, Apache helicopter. Mm-hmm. I saw a list the other day. It's a bunch of, the Tomahawk missile, mm-hmm. right? So that's how much the frontier, even in the absence of Native Americans within his definition, I think the definition still has this, we're still playing with it because there's a timelessness that might hide the violence, but when you factor in the violence, it does show in the present, in the sense of, you could even say mascots, but especially power projections abroad through military.
Yeah. So I was thinking about what you just said there. A thing that I was thinking about that's just, I don't know, to me kind of interesting, I guess, is, sometimes and I don't know about this in the context of like history, but sometimes like one of the explicit justifications that is offered for example, people going west and describing them as settlers or that they get to use the land or something. Sometimes the view is, well, there wasn't anything there, nobody was doing anything with it or something like that, right? Yeah. And I think that an interesting thing to me is thinking about how you define that. Partly because my very little inadequate knowledge that I have of Native peoples and their agrarian practices suggests that in many cases in some sense they did modify the land, but it wasn't like the modification that we think about when we think about like farming that European settlers would have been used to. So there's still, I'm just thinking about, in philosophy and political philosophy, somebody like John Locke who would say like, part of how do I come to own something? How does it come to be my property? Well, I mix my labor with it and I produce something, right? And you could maybe see something like that behind the claim that, well, people weren't doing anything with it and these people are just doing something with it, and so then it becomes theirs or something like that. But that relies on, I think, an inaccurate understanding of like what kind of time and effort and causal interaction the Native peoples had with the land, even if it wasn't something like that. So I don't know. I wonder if that goes well with kind of what you're describing as thinking about the history and understanding of like the frontier as a place of absence and a place where there's still land, there's still a place to go, there's still things that are untamed and wild that need civilization brought to them or something that like there's something like that maybe in the background there too.
Yeah, I mean it goes back before early 1800s, 1700s. The idea that from sort of this European point of view, there's no gardens, right? It's sort of the land is not being used efficiently, right?
Sure.
This idea that especially for the famous example, the Cherokees, right, in sort of that Georgia area, leads to the Trail of Tears. But this, the Cherokees kind of adopt some of the ways that the U.S. government's trying to get them to settle.
Sure.
Farming and all that stuff. And it was an attempt to save the land, but also it's sort of modeling your behavior on the expectations of this sort of white American government and their way of describing or defining how the land is properly used.
Sure.
Obviously, that didn't really help Cherokees for other reasons besides
Sure.
the racial like in the end of the day you have to get out because white settlers want the land.
Well, it makes me think about too the settling of like, or not settling I guess, but the boom in Oklahoma, right, of like for a long time that, and again this is drawing on my very sparse knowledge here, but that was a time after many Native peoples were forcibly moved from their lands and relocated. They got relocated there, and then eventually, once people decided, right, we want to be there, they got moved again, right? Which is, if you look at like how Oklahoma City was founded, I think about OU, right? That's where I went for my master's and PhD, and the mascot is the Sooner. But the Sooner is like a thief. A Sooner is a person who was in Oklahoma before they were supposed to be, so they could get the land.
Okay.
So it's a very strange kind of thing to celebrate in a certain way. But there's a really interesting. A journalist wrote. There's a book called Boomtown. I can't think of the guy's name, but it's kind of a mixture of some very interesting stuff about how Oklahoma City as a city started, but also the basketball team. The Thunder being relocated from there. And the Thunder, they did like one of their jerseys a few years ago was, it's kind of explicitly supposed to be inspired by like a lot of the Native American people that are still in Oklahoma. And so, I don't know, this is just an interesting way all of these things intersect in an interesting way. But
well, then there's the court case from a few years ago that all of a sudden returned half the state back to indigenous peoples, right? Which again, it's sort of like the story's not done.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
So we're not finished with
Absolutely.
it.
Yeah.
It's also interesting, sort of the banality of conquest.
Sure.
Right, where it's just now it's the Sooner. Like I had no idea. I never looked it up. It was just,
Sure,
to me, it was just a college that OU. Right?
Yeah.
The OU Sooners. Okay, next.
Yes. Boomers and Sooners describe particular people who basically, I mean, even aside from the obviously immoral and probably illegal contractually forcible relocation of the people that land had been given to or reassigned to or whatever. The government basically decided at some point, okay, here's the date on which it's kind of free for all. Anyone can go in and get land or whatever. And a bunch of people, including particular moneyed interests and corporations, said, we're not going to wait. So we're going to basically have people there, and then they're going to kind of slide, they're going to do something, they're going to deceive in some way, but like Boomers and Sooners refer to both of those different, I guess, variants of the kind of person who went in too early and kind of cheated their way in or something too.
Oh,
so
wow.
That's interesting. I'm sorry, your comments about the frontier just made me think of all of this. So
yeah, I mean, it's sort of I mean, that's what I do. I do like going back and reading Turner because one, you always read it with, okay, what's the environment in the 1890s?
Sure,
right? Like what are their norms?
Yeah.
But there's always this kind of there's a curve in it that. He's onto something with this collision, right? Like, I always think of like modernity in the world, right? Modernity isn't necessarily the imposition, more or less, of European ideas onto non-Europeans. I've always thought of it more of, it's a collision. It's the collision resulting from an attempted imposition of European ideas.
Okay.
Right? Or it's the... what happens when European market or trading relationships enter a space that had a different set of trading relationships.
Sure.
And suddenly you're able to access certain things from the European trade network that undermines so much of, right?
Those existing.
Yeah. And so suddenly, without you knowing it, you are now modern. Because you are now within that realm, like you are now using muskets, or you are now using automatic weapons.
Sure.
Right? Like you are adapting to these things. So it's, in many ways, modernity itself, right? From 1500s to arguably the present. Like modernity is what happens to people that have to deal with the arrival of technology and the arrival of new ideas that might undermine existing.
Sure.
And then we're all reacting to it, right?
Yeah.
Everyone reacts in a different way.
Yeah.
But the other thing at the World's Fair, if Turner's not talking about Native Americans, they are at the fair, right? And this is, one of those sort of, it's the photographs are taken, so we have all the evidence. It's the 1890s are, going into the 20th century. It's like the height of human zoos.
Yeah.
Right? So you would have human beings behind bars, and right, there's a famous, I can't remember the name, I'd have to look it up, but in New York City at the turn of the century, I think a man from the Congo was on display next to a gorilla, I think. But this, the 1893 World's Fair, basically the fair organizers set up villages for Native Americans, and it was to show the primitive life, right, of these, right, the so-called savages.
So Ota Benga was an Mbudi man who was exhibited at the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904, and also in a human zoo in 1906 at the Bronx.
Okay.
And he was often paired with an orangutan, which most people regard it to as, this is from Wikipedia, as an offense to his humanity, but also as a promotion of Darwinism. So
Interesting.
Yeah.
The other part too is, so you'd have these villages for indigenous people, but then you would have them juxtaposed with images of Indian boys and girls attending these government schools, right? And that was, thinking of Darwinism, there's,
Sure.
It's the idea that the government was civilizing the Indians. And the sort of another layer of atrocity on all of this stuff is this is also the moment of the extinction thesis, right? The extinction thesis basically said that there's certain people around the world, again, it comes out of the social Darwinism,
okay,
that these different groups of people are eventually going to go extinct, right? So to do something for them is, there's no point. African Americans were deemed a part of that group. American Indians.
This is called the extinction thesis?
Extinction thesis.
Interesting.
And this again comes out of racial science, right? We're getting into eugenics by the turn of the century.
Yeah.
But it's sort of swirling around all these conversations.
Yeah.
At the height of imperialism, right? All that kind of thing. For African Americans at the fair, right, at this point in the 1890s, the popular press is regularly denigrating African Americans as lazy criminals waiting for special treatment from the federal government. And again, this is sort of the stamp. This is the post-slavery stamp. So you replace the mechanisms of slavery with these stereotypes and caricatures that justify policies that replace slavery. So in this case, right, the rise of Jim Crow, ongoing sort of criminal justice, inequality, that sort of thing. And this is also the moment that the South is, right, reorienting their constitutions to curtail black voting. Lynching, right, is in its second decade of expansion. But at the end of the day, you have this sense of, especially with the Native Americans, you have the Buffalo Bills Wild West show.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's significant because we're in the 1893. When did the West end? It's like 5 years. Like what's the date? But you already have sort of a show that's built around a nostalgia.
Yeah.
So you've commodified, right, you've commodified the thing Turner theorizes, this collision and engagement, and now you're selling that experience by go to the Buffalo Bills Wild West show.
Yeah.
And all of this is, it's modern in the sense that it's traveling around and everyone kind of has a chance to go see this.
Yeah.
The other thing this is the decade of the birth of film, right?
Okay.
And so some of the earliest images Edison took were of Native Americans, right? So it's all this stuff's happening at once.
Yeah.
The other thing, and this is where you'd kind of point to sort of atrocity as a the canary in the coal mine. The fact that they did have human zoos and that you could go see villages and I want to go see the Indian village and see how did people live back then.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. Or you want to go to the Buffalo Bill to see how the Old West.
Yeah.
This points to this impulse of we are in a different time and we crave this the idea of a simpler existence that's been now commodified, which I think even in our own time, right, selling the 50s or something like selling the 60s as this commodified period still makes a lot of money.
Absolutely, yeah. Do you so you're describing this it's like a commodification of almost like a simpler time or a simpler life. I wonder how much of it do you think is just I guess for lack of a better term kind of garden variety escapism? Like if I guess I don't know enough about the material conditions on the ground of 1893, but I would imagine for many people their life was, full of mundane, irritating, I got to do the same thing over and over. In the same way that now I think, a lot of people both in, I don't know, what you describe as like blue collar jobs or white collar jobs, it's like I click on a button over and over. I'm in my cubicle for 40 hours just staring at my little screen or whatever. And so then you maybe have an impulse to spend 15 hours on a weekend playing Skyrim or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
And part of what explains that, I think, is just kind of general escapism, right? I'm dissatisfied with the way my life is, and so I want to, even for a few hours, inhabit a different kind of, going back to when, like maybe a different agency, different setting, a different background. How much of this do you think, I guess, is something like that versus like something that is very particular and specific to like the West or to, an untouched time in the past when everything was better, right? A kind of golden period that we've all fallen from, or kind of something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the West for the United States is the main component in that.
Sure.
The other thing too is the idea that you could even do this.
Sure.
Right. So it's
kind of romanticized in a certain way.
If you can't execute the idea to sell it, it's impossible.
Yeah.
Right? But by the 1890s, you're able to put together something to sell, and you're selling it in a certain way that taps into that existing need.
Okay.
Because that need also is, you could say that some of those, like the dime novels of the time period.
Yeah.
Oh, I could do that. Oh, wait, did you know that you could go down and you can actually see real cowboys and real Indians at the...
Instead of just reading it on a page
the
or
Buffalo
something.
Bill Wild West show.
Yeah.
And there could be names there. So you'll actually get to see the very people that...
Yeah, you've been reading about in these tawdry...
And to me, there's a change in that. Right?
Sure.
Like... and that makes it, So
that's like escapism combined with
with the
like
rise of this mass communication media.
Yeah.
The ability to make things happen that way. But the other thing that's happening too is that there's a depression begins right in the 1890s.
Okay.
Related to gold. I think one of the elements at least within the global economy, and you see this in the 70s going into the 80s. A lot of times the global economy, when it clicks into a new mode, right? It just wreaks havoc.
Okay.
And what's taking place in that late turn of the century is really that the rise of laissez-faire, British sort of a British-led capitalism and. I'm always skeptical of like one thing that made a depression happen. Like, there's too many complicated things at work here.
Causation is
there has to be multiple things happening. But as we know, there's during these decades there were these fights over silver. Right, the populace, the Colorado miners obviously want silver circulating. I think the Silver Purchase Act is repealed in 93. But this sets off, right? And again, we're looking at the 1896 election as a crucial year. So if this is 93 and, businesses are firing workers and cutting wages to stay afloat, workers are striking to retaliate. Populist farmers and workers are advocating for American government against monopolies. They're also calling for the government ownership of railroads. So these are kind of radical ideas circulating. The middle class, there's this line in here, the middle class blame the silver agitators. The Westerners and populists blame those opposed to the coinage of silver. Right? Sort of these debates going back and forth. Which leads to that 1896 campaign, and this is some have said that this is like the beginning of this thing called System of 96, right? This idea that you have a coherent system of a form of government between 1896 and 1932.
Okay,
and this is sort of the beginning of it. So it creates a familiar government that we could recognize in the sense that. I think it's one of the most expensive campaigns up to that point. The middle class is scared because the Democrats
and this is
are running.
The middle class based on Richardson's discussion,
based on
which
Richardson's,
is not just socioeconomic or even maybe non-primarily socioeconomic, but with this particular idea about individualism versus special interests. Okay.
Yeah, it's sort of that.
Just want to clarify.
It's what Richardson's been talking about.
Yes.
That the group that doesn't want special interests, whether it's big business. But in this sense, they do kind of jump in, and it's like, well, I don't care about big business because, at this point, Republicans are the big business government by 96. And they're running it, and it's McKinley against William Jennings Bryan, who is a populist, right, and then moves into the Democrat. The Democrats kind of take the populist platform, water it down, and run with it. But that obviously scares people, and so it becomes sort of, as Richardson writes, mainstream Americans had a clear vision of a world in which hardworking individuals could rise together, protected by an activist government that curbed business and organized labor. And also protected the individualist family, right? And that's what how the campaign is framed. It's these populists who want all this stuff, right? And they lose that election. 96, right? The safety valve in all this is the discovery of gold in Canada, which creates another gold boom. But more gold, it brings the prices down.
Sure.
And so it sort of acts as a safety valve on, easing, as Richardson, easing the pressure on farmers and laborers.
Yeah.
The other part too, in 1890s, and this connects to sort of ideas of race, and sort of the 30 years after the end of slavery. For the most part, middle class Americans, white Americans, believed African Americans' access to civil and voting rights was too fast, and thought that they didn't want to work for these issues, right? So the idea is African Americans didn't want to work to get these rights, right? The irony, of course, is for especially white men, you're born with the rights. It's inherent. It's self-evident.
Yeah, at least landed ones or something.
Yeah. I mean, by this time, it's really anyone.
Yeah, but that itself is a change from an earlier period.
Yeah, the earlier turn of the century, 100 years before, it was the landed.
Yeah.
But sort of the post-Jackson era, Jacksonian era, white American male is autonomy. Yeah. Right.
You have the right to vote, and
it's self-evident, and so it's. Again, and this gives us a view into that, into the minds, right, where this idea that, you need to earn these rights, whereas other groups are just born into it, right, and then the sentiment, right, went into 1896 Supreme Court decision of Plessy versus Ferguson, which again, right, there's an interesting sort of, if 1896 to 1932 is sort of this era, and then you have 1932 to really 1968, right? That era that comes after is, that's when the welfare state, but then you have the steady expansion of rights, right, to these historically marginalized groups. Plessy defines that period, and then Brown v. Board defines that second period in some ways. And then finally we have, this, near the end of all this, the reunion, right, between North and South. And what Richardson says is, the idea, right, this reunification ultimately came not from a resolution of the disagreements over the nation's political economy, but from the powerful Western image that the American people had come to associate with American values. Right, and so this is where you have this idea of the West, right, and then it's woven into this middle class ideal, right, and then this to me is what happens when there's no land left, right? The post 1890 consensus, and she continues, in 1896 they made these values grounds for the political action in the Spanish-American War, asserting American individualism in a foreign arena, right? So aside from maybe Hawaii, right, it's these sort of values that are tied to the West, to westward expansion, it helps to justify, right, like taking the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico,
sure,
Cuba, places like that, and again, going back to those, weapons, the Apache helicopter, I want to say it's, the early version of, the idea that you call enemy territory Indian country, right? Which I think begins in Vietnam.
Oh, okay.
And it was only recently, quote, stopped in Afghanistan, I think.
Oh, okay.
Where a general just kind of stepped in and said, there is
this was common usage in military.
In military, just like when you're like, oh, it's an Indian country.
I see.
And there was a significant number of Native Americans in the military, and why, as the general was saying, why are we still using this terminology?
Yeah, that's interesting.
The other part in this too is, if you're doing, a history of the West or the Western, Owen Wister's The Virginian, which as a book comes out in 1902, but these are, right, we talked a little bit last time about, they're short stories published in magazines. And these started between like 1893 and May of 1902. And then it was packaged together as, as sort of
serialized.
This book. Yeah. And one, it made the Western novel respectable, right? A respectable genre. But it created the archetype, right? The model for the West, and it helped to solidify things that Buffalo Bill's Wild West show were already doing.
Sure.
Right. And it helped to cement. So again, when we're thinking of like Red Dead Redemption, it's already past this period.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And when you're playing the game, there's all these moments that are signposts, especially at the epilogue, where I think John Marston asks his son, "Oh, you like stories about the Wild West?" And John Marston was, arguably part of it. But even as a kid, because we just got done going through Red Dead 2, you saw it.
Yeah.
Like you saw sort of the Wild West. When that comes up in the game, I just was laughing because it's like that is spot on. Where you're, but the other part too, and this is something that we'll talk about in a second.
Sure.
The other books were about like King Arthur and knights, right? Because this idea of like a medieval past also is a thing that is bubbling through this sentiment over the anxiety of the present. So it's not just the West, but it's again looking
some
at
other
the medieval past as it's simple and there's good and bad, and so the idea that the game that the makers of the game threw that in there too within the same conversation is really kind of an interesting moment in the game. As a nerd, like looking at the little mundane things here.
Sure.
The other thing that Wister does is he dedicates the book to Theodore Roosevelt, right? Right, who he thought inspired Americans to return to honest public men and civic virtue. Right, and this is sort of that Republican ideal, right? A wealthy man needs to, give back and do good, right? And Roosevelt, right or wrong, is seen as someone who, quote, stood up against, right, like the trusts, and some of that's overplayed, but the idea that he is remembered that way is significant because what it does is it shows that people from that wealthy class, which if I'm not mistaken, the Roosevelts, a lot of their fortune came from Turkish opium exports.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, I think they were part of during that, the opium wars, right? Where you're bringing opium from India to China. Other countries, the U.S. participation in that, the U.S. access to opium came through Turkey, or what was modern day Turkey.
Sure.
And then but I remember reading somewhere that that's a part of the Roosevelt fortune.
Interesting.
Is drug trading, trafficking. So
that's right. Yeah.
Well,
if you do it long enough ago.
it becomes
Doesn't
legit,
matter.
right?
Yeah,
It's the British East India Company.
Yeah.
So, and this is what Wister wrote. If this book be anything more than an American story, it is an expression of American faith, which I thought is really significant. Our democracy has many enemies, both in Wall Street, and in the labor union. So there's that sentiment. But I believe that with mistakes at times, but with wisdom in the main, we people will prove ourselves equal to the severest test to which political man has yet subjected himself, the test of democracy.
Yeah.
But this idea, it's both an American story, but it's also an expression of American faith.
Yeah,
so
that's interesting.
The West isn't a story. It's like, there's the weird admission. It's not a story. It's a faith that's built off this image, right? Which, again, is really fascinating because an image is not real, it's constructed, right? And so you base a reality off the ideal, the image, which is the faith, right? Built into this American, like faith in sort of the American story here.
Yeah.
I don't think I've read this book a couple times. I missed that
particular.
But that idea that it's a story, yes.
Yeah.
But it's also faith. And what's the,
in a certain way of living, or in a certain idea about the distribution of goods or of good and evil or something like that.
But it's not even on like a very concrete level. It's just a faith.
Yeah, some general, non-specific.
Yeah. So, you might not attack monopolies, but you're still going to hold on to this faith.
Yeah.
Like what's that? You have both things, but you can state that you're a moderate.
Yeah.
But
it's a very human thing to do, to want to have your cake and eat it too.
Yeah.
All the good stuff and none of the bad stuff, in my view, or whatever. Yeah.
But, and then you have, like, with the faith, you always have Dutch, right? Like, always.
Yeah. Have you lost faith in me?
Have you lost faith in me?
Yeah.
And so it's almost as if
it recurs there too. Yeah, that's interesting.
Playing after reading this, and like, I played another round last couple of days. Yeah. A few here and there. And he's like, you're losing faith.
Yeah.
You're losing faith in the story.
Yeah.
If you lose faith in the story, we're going to fall apart.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like Dutch having this existential conversation with history, but also self-conscious that it's really faith that's keeping us going. Faith in this story.
Well, I think the way that I take a lot of the Dutch Arthur, and sometimes Dutch and Hosea, right, discussions about whether they've lost faith in him or something is, anytime you have a group of people working together, that's really difficult to do, right? It's difficult to orchestrate your means to the right end. It's difficult to marshal all of those interests, to engage them in the right direction. And if you start losing faith in Dutch's leadership, then there's going to be less or no direction for the gang, and then they're going to end up just kind of deteriorating. Yeah. And so I think, one way to think about this is certainly as like faith in the American story or faith in America. Another way to think about it is just part of what we do when we think about just engaging with other people, right? Just any kind of social action with other people, we really have to give them a lot of trust and assume that we're going to treat each other the right way, and we're not going to immediately take advantage of each other or something. I always think about this when I think about like driving on the road. So every time I drive, I think about the fact that the only thing that's really separating me and the person going the direct opposite direction is, for most of the time, a yellow line painted on a road, which would have no physical stopping power, but I'm assuming that they're not going to come into my lane or something, right? Yeah. So I have just assume and have faith in the fact that like they're not going to drive in this really wild way. Otherwise, I would never want to get on the road, right?
Yeah.
The
other part too, right? When Roosevelt eventually gets into office, she writes that the romantic view of the idealized cowboy was the appropriate symbol of the nation, right? So it becomes, right?
Yeah.
We're waiting for John Wayne, right? To emerge at that point. But she continues, the cowboy image carried with it the ideology of individualism. It was an anti-government anti-urban, anti-special interest image. It was one that defined the American individualist around a domestic woman, and one that must be protected by government activism. Right, so there's that the paradox, right? The individualist can only be an individualist around a domestic woman, which is, basically it's the patriarchy.
It requires a dependent relationship.
Yeah, I need, and it's really, I always think of domestic, if you say domestic woman, it's someone who's going to do the labor you don't want to do, that allows you to do this other labor. But then the irony, right, is the activist government. And to me, that's some of the, what becomes common sense that comes out of the populace, right? Because the populist arguments that really get, that have a hold are the arguments that can be universalized. Yeah. The 8-hour day. Yeah. Right. It's not specifically pointing out, like, we don't get an end to monopolies, really. Yeah. You don't get to nationalize the railroad. Yeah. But sort of vague ideas, say like a direct vote of senators. Sure. If everyone can benefit from the idea that will be woven into the common sense, which really it's the New Deal that 30 years later, the New Deal kind of begins to bring in some of these sort of populist progressive ideas that are coming around. Finally, it was an expansionist image. And I think this is, again, it's the shift from 1890s going into the 1900s. Right. The U.S. has always expanded. It's expanded across the continent. Hawaii, again, is sort of an exception. But the moment that, the Spanish-American War happens and suddenly you are possessing the Philippines, which I think we hold till 1946. Cuba, which we set up their constitution. Guantanamo Bay is a product of that. Puerto Rico, which, think of today's debates. It's not a state, but everyone there is taxed and you can be drafted. Yep. So what exactly is Puerto Rico today?
What is its status? And
and there's obvious reasons, racial reasons, why Puerto Rico was never brought in as a state, versus Hawaii and Alaska. Right? Yeah. They became states. Why not Puerto Rico? Yeah. Right. So this expansionist image for this individualism deeded to America by God must spread around the world as the best possible system of human government. Right. And that kind of is that sort of we have the best government and it's in our best interest to spread this everywhere. Right. Which if you look at like W's rhetoric, to justify,
spreading democracy in the Middle East.
Yeah, that's really, again, this stuff doesn't necessarily go away. Yeah. But and actually we do get to see this in the game with Guarma. Right, I think it's chapter 5. Yeah. And so you do get to go to the Caribbean. You do get to see the sugar plantations. You do get to see revolutionary movements that arguably are modeled off the Cuban, the Cuban sort of the revolution happening in Cuba against the Spanish, that the Americans basically step in and defeat the Spanish and then basically ignore the revolutionaries and then set up the government.
Interesting.
Right. Yeah. But the revolutionaries were fighting the Spanish for decades before. But in Red Dead, you do get that taste of it, right? Yeah. I thought that's an interesting addition to all this.
Absolutely.
But the one part that I brought in, and the students didn't get to read this, but it's from a book, T.J. Jackson Lear's book, No Place of Grace, Anti-Modernism and the Transformation of American Culture, 1880 to 1920. It was published in the early 80s. And what this book explores is this vast range of what he calls anti-modern attitudes. And this is really a response to, the onset of this corporate bureaucratic forms of organization. Yeah. The idea that, it seemed as if everyone is getting over civilized, right?
Yeah.
Teddy Roosevelt, right? That was the whole like, you need to go exercise and be, vigorous and all this kind of stuff. The rise of sports, right? Yeah, like all that stuff is
national parks.
Yeah, everything's kind of this is a part of it, but the rhetoric is really this. What Lear's is arguing is that anti-modernism is what fuses together with the reality of this corporate world. And then that inaugurates the 20th century, and that becomes the new norm, right? The idea that I think earlier when this idea that the West brings together the nation, right? Post-Civil War.
Yeah.
A part of the idea of the West is this anti-modern that is in a weird relationship with the most cutting edge industry, but also clerks and workers doing, putting a piece on and then the conveyor belt moves, putting another piece on, conveyor belt moves. Yeah. And this like kind of brain dead work. What are we if that's all we're doing?
Yeah, sure.
And a part of this goes back to it Jackson Lears calls is the shift from a Protestant ethos of salvation through self-denial to a therapeutic ideal of self-fulfillment in this world through exuberant health and an intense experience. Right.
Kind of hedonism or something.
Yeah, but it's a version of that. And what they're really, the search is for an authentic experience. Right. Okay. Again, which is interesting because how do you define authentic? Sure. Right. But in this time, if we look at the Wild West show, that could be deemed as this authentic experience. The whole idea of Red Dead, to be able to play a Western, is somehow this authentic experience. Yeah. Right.
Well, certainly it seems like authenticity is something that the developers of the game were aiming at in certain parts of the game, at least.
Yeah, and it drives the logic. But this idea of searching for an authentic experience with the goal of sort of this physical, emotional, spiritual, right, release or rejuvenation, and we see this. This is where I like kind of this. That phrase anti-modern, because this is something it's happening in Europe too. And a part of the avant-garde that arises during this time, right? If we think of, Picasso, getting inspiration from African art, the rise of jazz, which is seen as this authentic expression. It's real versus this stale American pop music coming out of New York City. Okay. Jazz is real, right? It's for all sorts of racist connotations that are plugged into it. Sure. But it's obviously hitting this need in people, and it's creating this argument that is really, situated around ideas of civilization and ideas of savagery. Right. So both Europe and the United States are really struggling with, we live in this industrial bourgeois society. What can we expect? Yeah. In the US, the shadow of that 1890 census is always there. There's no such thing as the West anymore. It's closed. Yeah. What do you do at this point? The other thing I thought of too is this, like sort of what comes after the Enlightenment, like Romanticism. The idea that the Enlightenment's cold, it's universal. Yeah. And the backlash is this Romanticism which is, infuses nationalism with this, this ethnicity, culture. It's more local, right? It's very much
we're focused on a certain kind of emotional experience.
Yeah, versus
reason or something.
Yeah, and I thought that, it's sort of, again, it's reading all this, it's like just obviously a very human, it's like, oh, we've gone too far.
Let's let the pendulum swing back a little bit or something.
Yeah. The idea of like, the cult of science and technical rationality, right? We should get back to authentic experience. which seems to have disappeared in the managed world. Nostalgia for real-life experience includes, right, the rustic, childlike, simple life, right, amidst all these crises of industrial capitalism, class, ethnic conflicts, government corruption.
Yeah.
Right. Again, it's this, we want this simple sort of nostalgia for the past. The other part of this is, the practice of denying the dark side of, right. There's certain contemporary phrases about, making the nation great again. But for some people, it's, the question would be, well, what time period are you going to?
Sure, yeah.
Because during that time period...
Wasn't great for everybody.
I didn't have rights during that time period,
Yeah.
right? Is it before the 70s, right?
Yeah.
Women's rights kick in part of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So is it before 1964?
Yeah.
Right? What's the time period of this? So it's...
Sure.
And again, this is, this is this ideal, kind of denying the dark side is very much a part of, again, that's probably a human history. But one of the things that Lears talks about, he writes, quote, individual will and action were hemmed in by the emerging iron cage of a bureaucratic market economy, but the trouble ran deeper. The rationalization of urban culture and the decline of religion into sentimental religiosity further undermined a solid sense of self. For many individual identities began to seem fragmented, diffuse, perhaps even unreal. A weightless culture of material comfort and spiritual blandness was breeding weightless persons who longed for intense experiences to give some definition, some distinct outline and substance to their life.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Right. So, and again, the question would be, well, was that really there, or is that a longing for this constructed image, or the longing for the faith of this story that is a story, but it's also faith?
Yeah.
Right. In other words, the struggle is no longer there. Right. And again, when we go back to Turner, if it's this engagement, it's the struggle between the European and the American environment, which includes human beings.
Sure.
That defines the American. But when that struggle's over, how does the American define themselves?
Yeah.
Like there's nothing to struggle against.
Yeah.
So are we going to not be Americans anymore because that struggle is gone?
Yeah, so some of this really, it seems like, results from, either a lack of clarity or understanding or content in the idea of what an American is. What it means to be American or something like that.
The other part that I found interesting, the idea of diary keeping. Right. So again, thinking of Arthur, students doing their own diaries from the example of Arthur, but the idea that this diary keeping was a thing to do, right? At the introspection, etc. So this frustrated helplessness of the era leads to, right, this idea of the the anti-modern. Again, I have some notes here about the human zoo, which we've already discussed, but the idea that, behind that atrocity is getting to see it. This is the uncivilized, right? So it's and that's that complicated. You're yearning to see it, perhaps even touch, but you despise it, right? Because you despise the human. You've removed their humanity by putting them in the cage. But there's this weird draw to it, right?
You're not treating them as an end in themselves.
Anticipating
our Kant discussion coming up.
And very interestingly, like the rise of jazz also is the rise of, at least during the recorded era, of blues music. Right? So blues music itself is, right, like what comes out of the post-Civil War era, which is a mishmash of, field songs, work songs, religious songs that comes together through the individual. Right? Because those songs are collective and performed in a group. The blues song is the individual expression. So it's once severed from the group, and now you're forced. Really, I mean, most blues musicians, they're trying to earn a living, trying to earn money, trying to be unique.
Mm-hmm.
But there's the development of this music that becomes a core of jazz, but it's seen as this, it's authentic.
Yeah.
It's authentic music versus sort of
manufactured
a white mainstream pop music.
Yeah.
And when you look at like what happens across, from the 20s on, blues music still dominates. Hip hop is the pop music of the time, and you can't have hip hop without the music that comes before that.
Sure.
All blues.
Sure,
the blues weaves through all of it.
Yeah.
Right. And so
a lot of rock and roll traces very explicitly on blues ancestry,
country music, even. So
absolutely.
And again, it's the love-hate. Right. You could even tie this back to like minstrelsy, blackface minstrelsy, which is still, I think by this time, blackface minstrelsy is a nostalgia.
Okay.
Right. It's already a nostalgia for a past. By this time, 1890s turn of the century, you now have African Americans doing blackface. Right. Because it starts out with the Irish and then Jewish men, right, in that post-Civil War, right, they're beginning to, do that craft. Okay. And then African Americans start becoming popular. I want to say like Bert, I can't remember the last name. One of the most highest paid actor performances is this African American who was performing blackface. But all of this is that love-hate, right? You yearn for the uncivilized, the emotional, right? That's all, all these sort of racialized ideas about the simple, or childlike, right? You yearn for that, but at the same time you hate it, right? Lynching, right? I think of Kenya during this time. The British are just going through and wiping out villages to cleanse the land to bring in white settlers. You have the Congo with, basically turning that into Leopold's private estate.
Yeah, Switzerland, right?
Belgium.
Thank you.
And, just atrocities built on atrocities. Tarzan, right? The stories of Tarzan, where it's, Tarzan is the ultimate expression. Right? Yeah. And this idea that, the white supremacy of white men, even in the jungles, they can become king of the jungle. Right. But also Tarzan as this authentic. Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's sort of like he's the version of him in the United States is the mountain person
or something.
Yeah. Think of the Revenant. I just started watching a little bit of that yesterday. Yeah. And so it's all this stuff has this weird, nostalgia, love, hate. You love the idea, but you hate the reality of it. Yeah. Right. Because it's almost as if it reminds one of the atrocity, right? You love the idea of, right? And you hear this with mascots.
Being in nature or something.
Yeah, like you hear this with mascot. Like, it's mascots are, it's putting.
Some people take it to be a way to honor.
To honor. Like that. Yeah. But the reality of it is, to honor, would you give back the land?
Sure. Yeah.
No way, right? Like it's. Or that pipeline from a few years ago. You're going through indigenous land
South
again.
Dakota or North Dakota.
Yeah, and so it's just like, at what point do you love the image, but you hate
don't
the
care
reality
about the individual or the people or something like that.
Right. And again, that when we look at U.S. history, it's sort of that's the complicated part between the love of the ideal, the ideal of freedom. Yeah. But then it's put into practice with like slavery and like all these other things. The other part too, I think, right, is the agreeing part of this, right? Because there's a bunch of different groups that we don't have to go into. In each chapter, I think he goes through different expressions of this anti-modernism, but the main part that everyone sort of pulls everything together. Modern culture had narrowed the range and diffused the intensity of human existence. They longed to rekindle possibilities for authentic experience, physical or spiritual, possibilities they felt had existed once before long ago, which might lead into...
Yeah, well, I don't know how well that leads into Kant, but let's talk about Kant a little bit. So this week in our ethics section, everybody had 3 required chapters, 2 on Kant and 1 on feminist ethics. And so as a reminder, this is from the textbook, The Fundamentals of Ethics by Shafer-Landau. And so, again, just kind of orienting ourselves and thinking about what we're doing, at least in sort of the ethics section of the course, we're kind of doing like a very quick, let's get familiar with like moral reasoning and ethical theory. And I think the purpose of that in my mind is because when we want to do these, we want to talk about and analyze and sort of carefully evaluate situations or states of affairs or however you want to describe it, for ethical purposes. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? And when we're applying that to occurrences in the game and to decisions that you make in the game, in addition to, of course, thinking about it in the context of history, we want you to have some acquaintance with some formal ethical theory behind you to do that. So the reason that I picked Kant for this week is that Kant is, or in particular, Kantian ethics or deontological ethics are probably, at least in kind of the 20th century analytic philosophy area, in the development of analytic philosophy, and really just philosophy in kind of the English-speaking world for a big period of time, relatively recently in the last 150 years, the ethical outlooks really, it seemed like, came down to you're either some kind of Kantian or you're a utilitarian, right? And so a lot of discussion about ethics juxtaposes this idea of like, do my intentions matter or do the consequences of my actions matter? Is justice and kind of looking back for desert important, or am I looking forward to the consequences of actions and how things will affect people or whatever, right? Now, again, as I discussed last week when we talked about virtue ethics, there are certainly people who have rejected the only way to talk about ethics is those 2 sort of theories. And virtue ethics really, in a certain way, you can see it as a product of either reclaiming or recapturing something that was really important that kind of was lost in a lot of modern moral theorizing. I think Anscombe, one of the women I talked about last week, actually has a paper called Modern Moral Philosophy where she talks about why she thinks that the only 2 options are utilitarianism and deontology are really dissatisfying. But it is true that just historically these are really important in philosophy and in ethical theory. And the other thing that I would say is, we talked briefly about Bentham and Mill when we talked about utilitarianism, and those individuals, I think, I think they were very smart and very thoughtful, even if they got some stuff wrong, right? And so part of what we want to do when we're thinking about these ethical theories is, you hear this talked about sort of in science, right, where people stand on the shoulders of giants or something like that, right? And part of the idea here, I think, is we don't want to just ignore the work and the care and the time and the effort that have gone into really thinking carefully and developing carefully these sort of ethical theories. We might as well, use them, or at least see if they're useful. And so that's part of why I wanted us to talk about Kant today. And the other thing here really is that deontological theory, or Kantian theory, is, and I think still is, a really important contemporary theory. Just like I mentioned last time, there are contemporary virtue ethicists and contemporary utilitarians. There are also contemporary Kantians or contemporary deontologists. So there are a lot of living philosophers who think this is still maybe the right way to think about ethics, right? So just like last time, I'll talk a little bit about Kantian ethics. We'll talk a little bit about Immanuel Kant. We'll talk about some things that are really attractive about Kantian ethics. We'll talk about some things that are maybe not so attractive about Kantian ethics. And then we'll finish up by talking a little bit about feminist ethics as an additional approach. So by the end of the course, you will at least be minimally familiar with 4 very different ethical theories, in addition to the kind of cowboy ethics that is latent in the game, and it was in your kind of pre-read selection. So when we think about Kantian ethical theory, and I think that Shafer-Landau does a really good job. You probably noticed that these 2 chapters were a little different. Our consequentialism chapter had like one thing was all the attractions, all the things that are good about it, and you find attractive about it, and then one thing was all the problems. And Kantianism is a little more mixed just because there are really 2 very different strands in Kantian ethics. And so he really notes that in the chapter. And the first one in Kantian ethics, I guess the thing to say is in Kant and in deontological ethics, another way you can think about this, and sometimes philosophers will call it as just non-consequential ethics, is the focus is really on duty and action. So in utilitarianism, you have duty too, but again, my duty is really to do whatever will produce the best consequences. Here, there's this idea that there might be intrinsic rightness or wrongness of certain actions. So thinking about, an example that Kant likes is, making a promise to someone and then reneging on that promise or going back on that. Kant thinks that, but by doing that, you've done something wrong just because you have done that action, not because of particular consequences it leads to, but just by doing that action. So the 2 big strands in Kantian ethics, and this is reflected in Shafer-Landau, are this idea of sort of fairness or justice, and another way to think about this is really just like universalizability. So one way to think about fairness is, and this is a way to think about justice. In fact, the political philosopher John Rawls wrote a book called this, Justice as Fairness. But one way to think about justice is things are just when people get what they deserve, right? And you can think about this in a very kind of negative way in terms of moral blame, like a person who, say committed a bunch of atrocities deserves the death penalty or something like that. The idea there is would be a just system or a just outcome because they're getting what they're due, right? The notion of desert as a notion is an important notion in kind of Kantian ethics and deontological ethics. But the other part of this thinking about fairness is just, am I treating everyone in roughly the same way, right? So am I treating everyone in a way that means I'm not showing partiality, I'm not favoring any one person over another, and certainly I'm not favoring one person over another for a kind of morally irrelevant reason. So on this kind of Kantian view, that really this kind of fairness part comes out in the context of the principle of universalizability, or what some people will call the first formulation of the categorical imperative, which Kant uses a bunch of philosophy words, or at least we translate it in English, that you're supposed to act only on that maxim at which you could at the same time will it be a universal law. And the idea being, if I have a rule for myself that guides my action, I really should only do it if it could be universalizable. If I could say, it would be okay if everyone did this. So Shafer-Landau gives this example of sort of, making a promise that from the very beginning you don't even ever intend to keep, right? In particular, he gives this example of kind of a person who's gone into a lot of debt, and you know this person and they ask to borrow money from you, right? So if you give it, the only reason you would give it is if you think that promises generally are things that are held, right? But this person will not pay you back. They're not going to keep that promise. And so the point of this idea of universalizability is one way to think about this is a lot of immorality occurs when I make an exception for myself, right? When I say, well, everyone shouldn't steal except for me, I get to do that. Or no one should, physically assault other people except for me. I'm special, I get to do it, right? The whole idea of this is that a lot of times it's when we sort of make exceptions to the rule for ourselves that a lot of immorality comes out of. And that's a lot of what we see, I think, when we think about cases of injustice, is people are not being treated the same, right? They're being treated poorly on the basis of some kind of morally irrelevant characteristic. So this idea of justice is really does illuminate Kant's philosophy and what he's trying to propose, and certainly, what others later will develop as kind of what you can think of as neo-Kantian or just other kinds of deontological morality. So that idea of that first formulation of the categorical imperative, act only on that maxim that you can will would be universal law, is supposed to really get at this idea that, on Kant's view and on a deontological view more generally, moral rules should have that kind of universal appeal, right? If it's inappropriate, say, to disallow a person to vote or own property, I better have a really good reason. Otherwise, it should apply to everyone, right? And since it often doesn't, one way to locate the wrongness of, say, sexism or racism in kind of a deontological view is there's a violation of justice that's occurred, right? There's a violation of treating them in a certain way. And I think this actually leads really nicely into the second Shafer-Landau chapter, which is it's really, again, he doesn't talk about it this way, but you can describe it as this is really about the second formulation of the categorical imperative, where Kant says, act so that you treat human beings and treat humanity in particular always as an end in itself and never as a mere means. And so I want to talk about this language a little bit, because I think this plus the universalizability really helps us get a sense of what Kant is doing and what value might be in Kantian ethics. So the idea of a means and an end, you can think about this in the context of instrumental value and intrinsic value. So, I have a pen, right? And the pen is an object, and I value it instrumentally because what it allows me to do. So this particular pen I got from the Department of Communication Studies when it was still a standalone department, and I got it at, some kind of recruiting event, and I've been writing with it for the last couple of times we've been doing this podcast. So why I take this thing to be valuable is because what it allows me to do, right? So it doesn't have, I think, most of it doesn't have intrinsic value, but it's a means to an end, right? I treat it as a tool or as an object that I use to do a certain job. So I like this pen, or I find it valuable because it allows me to write, it allows me to express opinions, it allows me to communicate, all of that kind of stuff. Versus treating something like an end in itself, this is a pretty vague notion in Kant, but part of what I think he means, and certainly what later people who are still kind of neo-Kantians take it to mean, is if I'm treating you as an end in yourself, what I'm doing is treating you essentially as you're a kind of autonomous person, right? You're the kind of individual that can set their own ends, that has a certain kind of value, perhaps an infinite value, which is something that Kant and certainly later neo-Kantians would say about human beings, that they have a kind of infinite value because of the significance of what humanity is. And for Kant, and this is of course complicated, which I'm sure we'll get to in a second, by his writing of the human races, and Kant is sort of one of the probably not founder, but certainly one of the most important and influential voices in kind of scientific racism in the 1800s. But humanity, Kant explicitly says, means what I'm really focused on is that part of human beings that is both autonomous and rational. Kant thought those things were connected. He thought if I am heteronomous, that is, I don't set my own ends or goals, I let other people or I let society or let communities or groups set them for me, well, then I'm not really acting particularly rationally, right? So all of this, the reason I'm bringing this up in the context of humanity is because Kant thought that we treat lots of things as means to an end, right? We treat physical objects as means to an end. We're, recording this on a laptop, and in front of us is a table, right? And it turns out you can treat objects pretty much any way you want to, because going back to utilitarianism, right, they don't have any sense of well-being. They're not the kind of thing that can feel pain or pleasure. And so you can treat them as just as objects, right? You treat them as ends. If the table we're on breaks in half, we'll get a new table, and it will be maybe wasteful or something, but we might think no significant great moral wrong has been done to the table. But I think, and this is, I think, a real insight of Kant's, or at least of Kantian theory, is this idea that a lot of immorality, just like we talked about earlier, a lot of immorality comes from making exceptions for ourselves to the moral rule. Another way you can think about this is a lot of immorality occurs when you treat people as objects, right? When you treat them as mere means to an end. Now, as Shafer-Landau notes, and even Kant notes, it is certainly the case that when we engage with one another, we do often treat each other as means, but we don't do it as mere means. So Shafer-Landau gives this very silly kind of example of a plumber coming to his house. And it's true that the plumber is a means for Shafer-Landau to get his plumbing fixed, right? In a similar way, My father was really big into cars, and I took like 2 years of auto in high school, and I could maybe change my oil now, and that's about it, right? I just have no affinity for automobiles. So when I have a problem with an automobile, I have to call someone who knows a lot more than me, and I have to pay them to render me a service, right? So I'm treating them as a means, but it's also the case that I can do that in a way that also recognizes their humanity, that recognizes they're a person with their own interests and desires, and maybe even certain kinds of moral rights, right? So, but it's also the case, if you've ever worked in food service or really any service industry, you've probably come across people who just really treated you as a mere means, right? Who are angry with you because, their food is messed up. And so they yell at you because you're kind of like an emblem of the whole system to them, right? And so that fails to see you as a person. This idea of the what's called the second formulation, the categorical imperative, or sometimes what's called the ends in themselves formulation or something, or formula of humanity is what it's sometimes called, is this idea that a lot of immorality is treating people as objects. And notice that in a certain extent, consequentialism allows for that. If the best action I take that will be bring the greatest good for the greatest number of people requires that I treat a very small number of people like objects, well, that's going to be the right thing to do, right? In fact, that's going to be the obligatory thing to do and not just one that's morally permissible. On Kant's view, on this particular aspect of deontology, the idea is supposed to be anytime I do that, I'm doing something really awful. I'm violating some significant obligation I have because I'm treating a person as an object. And Kant thought you could do this to yourself. So, if I am part of humanity, or I am, an instance of humanity, I can also treat myself as a means to an end. And that is also wrong for me to do, right? It's kind of weird for us to think about now. We don't usually think about obligations you have to yourself in this significant moral way. But certainly Kant and many people at the time would have thought this is actually important, right? Which is you have certain kinds of duties to yourself, maybe to fulfill your talents or something, to perfect your talents or something like that, and certainly not to be abusive to yourself, right? So I think when you think about those things, there's a lot more to say, and I do want to talk a little bit about another idea of Kant's, that is the importance of goodwill and the importance of rationality. The basic idea in kind of deontology that I think is really helpful to contrast it with something like utilitarianism or consequentialism is, and Shafer-Landau does a really good job. He gives us like about 7, I think, kind of bullet points at the very end of chapter 12. It's the second Kant chapter. And he describes sort of these major differences between Kantians and consequentialists. But one of the things that I think is important to note, just if we're trying to kind of compare, is on a consequentialist point of view, the consequences are the thing that matter most. And from a utilitarian view specifically, what I should do is what leads to the greatest good for the greatest number of people, even if that includes some injustice, right? Even if that includes what we would describe as rights violations. On a Kantian view, basically I shouldn't do that. And in fact, sometimes, on Kant's view, acting immorally is the kind of thing that might cause other kinds of harm, right? Or might lead to negative consequences. And I just have to accept that that's the cost of acting morally. So, when we talked about virtue ethics, I don't remember if I talked about this specifically, but one thing about virtue ethics that I think is really interesting is virtue ethics holds that, when you're doing, if you train yourself over time, right, to have those virtues, then you're going to kind of want to do the good, right? It's going to be attractive to you. It's going to be very natural to you. You're going to feel good when you're doing the good. Remember, we gave the example of someone who's, helping out someone who's in need, and they're just thinking the whole time, ugh, I hate ladling stuff out of the soup kitchen or whatever, but they're doing it. Well, on a virtue ethics theory, you might say that's been a failure of theirs internally, because they aren't motivated by the right things, and they're not feeling the right emotions that are accompanying that action, right? Kant's view, I think, comes from a different perspective, which is, for many of us, and I'll include myself in this because sometimes I certainly find this to be true, what the right thing to do is not always the most pleasant thing to do or what we think we would really be in our best interest, say, and certainly is not something that we always want to do, right? And I think that is a real insight of Kant's, is that, and this is a very different view, again, from a virtue ethics view, which is sometimes doing the right thing is not about whether it feels good or whether you get like the accompanying kind of emotion. Part of it is really about like, do I know that this is the right thing to do? And if so, I have to do that, regardless of the fact that it's going to affect me negatively, or it's going to be upsetting to me, or it's going to be really hard. None of those are reasons not to do it. And depending on your particular form of consequentialism, those might turn out to be reasons not to do something, right?
Well, I think, I'm thinking in the early part of the game,
with
the train robbery.
Yes, yeah.
So you get to make the choice. Do you execute them?
That's right.
Or do you tell them just get back on the train?
Yeah, the workers that are on
yeah.
I can't think of the guy's name. Leviticus Cornwall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's that one. The other one that I ran into the other day was you're in Valentine and a guy says, "Hey, I saw you in Blackwater."
Yep.
And then you chase after him.
I just played that recently. Yeah.
And he falls over the edge, and then you choose, do you save him or do you let him fall to his death?
Exactly.
And I think the first time I played, I let him fall to his death.
Yeah, yeah.
But the second time I did it, you save him, and then that person's like, you saved my life, so I don't even know you, right?
Yes,
I will not say a thing.
Along with a healthy threat from Arthur.
And there's a healthy threat. So, and that to me is interesting because you're playing Arthur, but are you betraying Arthur by making that choice?
Yeah.
Because if Arthur is savvy, he would understand that the tough decision is letting that person die because your decision is going to affect all these people the gang. Yeah. And so I think when the player forces Arthur to let them live, right, it fits into a lot of these.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I think those two examples are actually a really, really good. Those are both really good examples to illustrate, and this is part of what I hope that all of the students are able to do too. There's going to be a lot of cases where all of our moral theories, roughly speaking, line up and say roughly the same thing, right? So as you've noticed already in Shafer-Landau, he's talked about how on a consequentialist view, there might be reasons to object to sexist, racist treatment, reasons to object to slavery. And the same thing is true on Kant's view. The same thing is almost certainly true on virtue ethics too, right? Not to mention maybe feminist ethics. But there are going to be cases where either we have a dilemma or we could go one way or another, and we genuinely it's not clear what we should do, maybe, or maybe it's just not clear what the right thing to do is. And from those kind of cases, sometimes the different ethical theories will give us a different answer. So I think, for example, that if you're a good consequentialist, given Arthur and given what is likely to happen, I think probably you just kill him in both of those cases, right? Again, part of this is thinking about, obviously in the second case, there's even a question about, I don't remember what the animation is if you choose kill. I don't remember if Arthur stomps his fingers or something. But, some people have thought that there's not a lot of difference between killing someone and just letting them die if you could intervene and save them, right? So suppose Arthur somehow does that. Well, he certainly led to the death of one person. But if Arthur has good reason to think that person is going to say, hey, the Vanderlyn gang is in Valentine, and that word is going to get back maybe to the Pinkertons, maybe to the O'Driscolls, right? And then people that you have other specific obligations to and prior existing relationships with are likely to be significantly harmed for that. Then maybe you think the one person dying does not override or outweigh all of the interests of these other people and the effects it's going to have on them, right? And the same thing I think is maybe true. If you think those train workers are likely to, holler, be like a canary or whatever, right? Like they're going to say, hey, we were robbed by these people. Well, that means that it's likely to be very specific retribution on you, on the people that you care about and stuff, right? Really, there's another aspect of this on consequentialism, which is on a consequentialist view, it might be okay to rob the train, Like if the money that's going to have all of this great effect on all of you is going to have a very minor negative effect on Cornwall given his fortune, maybe it's the right thing to do, right? Yeah. Whereas on a kind of deontological view, unless you can universalize it, you shouldn't steal. So again, maybe in that case, but like probably Dutch and Arthur are not only going to use the money for basics and for supplies for the camp. They're going to, blow some on whiskey or get a new gun or whatever, right? And then it becomes less obvious that you need the money in the way that you think stealing a loaf of bread is something where you need it, right?
Yeah.
But generally speaking, you're not focused on the consequences for Kant. You're focused on like, is this action the right or wrong action? Am I treating another person as a means to an end? So on Kant's view, I think on both of those cases, you should let them live. Because again, on Kant's view, what you're supposed to do is never treat a person as a mere means. And so the only reasons to kill somebody would be either maybe a case of self-defense, right? Where the only way that you can preserve your life is to end another person's life, or potentially, and a Kantian view is consistent with a kind of retributive sense of punishment, maybe if someone takes the life of innocent people, then they've forfeited their life. And it's the right way to treat them is to end their life or something, right? But most cases, and these two cases that Arthur deals with are not like those cases, right? And so in a Kantian view, you might say, no, he shouldn't kill those people. He should accept that even though they have different interests than him, even though he might endanger himself or his group, the right thing to do is to let them live, let them go. So that's a really good example, I think, of how you might come to a different conclusion about what the right thing to do is on the basis of what ethical theory you adopt or you take to be most persuasive or most accurate or something. So that's really good. Thank you. Another couple things I just want to mention in Kant, and then we'll talk, we kind of did this differently. Maybe I'll talk a very little bit about Kant's life, and we can certainly deal with Kant's discussion of race as well. Another couple things that I think are really interesting about Kantian ethics is this role for rationality. So Kant certainly took it to be one of the things that is most valuable about us. And if you talk about or read discussions and debates about, for example, how humans treat animals, a lot of the discussion follows this kind of Kantian path of this prizing of rationality, where you say, look, that is the thing that separates us from other animals, from non-human animals specifically, is we have this ability with language, we have the ability to reason abstractly, we have the ability to sort of be aware of ourselves and have higher order levels of consciousness, and that's valuable, and that's what makes it okay to, use animals in medical testing or cosmetic testing or industrial agriculture or whatever. It's the absence of that in those creatures that means it's okay to treat them that way, right? So at least in principle, and Kant doesn't always apply this, he explicitly doesn't apply this correctly in a few different cases, but in principle, Kant should also acknowledge, as Shafer-Landau notes, that this idea of humanity would really mean any kind of creature that would have that. So if, there were people from Mars that came down and they could talk and they could reason and they could explain and they could demonstrate this to us, then we would have every reason to treat them with a certain level of like moral respect or deference, or they'd be part of that moral community. This is going to lead into our moral community discussion. Before we continue that part, though, I do want to say this other thing, which is, on Kant's view, the only thing that is unqualifiedly good is a good will. And I think this is really interesting because I think that it's not always intuitive, so I want to talk about it a little bit. So, for example, in virtue ethics, a virtue ethicist would say, well, certain kinds of virtues are unqualifiedly good, like courage, right? Being courageous is unqualifiedly a good thing. Being compassionate is unqualifiedly a good thing. And utilitarians, especially Bentham and Mills, who are kind of hedonists, that is, they think pleasure is, if not the only, one of the most important things that you can value in life. They might say that being in a state of pleasure is unqualifiedly good, right? And that's what we're trying to aim at, is like happiness for everybody or something like that. Kant, I think, objects to this in a way that I think is really pretty insightful and interesting, which is Kant notes that all of the kinds of things that we think of as goods are the kinds of things that are often, they're more about, I guess I would say, like efficiency, or they have something else other than goodness. So for example, if I if a person is truly evil, they're probably more effective at bringing about their evil if they're intelligent and courageous and have all these other kind of good attributes, right? And in fact, it might even lead to a lot of joy for them to exterminate a bunch of people or commit atrocities on people, right? So on Kant's view, all of these things, right, all of these natural things that we describe as like natural goodnesses, like the virtues, or like things like intelligence or strength or something like that, all of those things are only good when they're sort of directed by a good will, right? Because if I were, I don't think I have any nemesis. I don't think there are any nemesis that I have or whatever. But if I had one, I would not want them to have all of these good qualities, right? I wouldn't want to hide. I'm no Sherlock Holmes. I don't want Moriarty that's going to match wits with me. I want the dumbest, most foolish, intemperate, right, cowardly nemesis, because they're going to wreck my life the least if they have all of those negative traits, right? Whereas if I have a nemesis that is incredibly intelligent and very powerful and very strong and charming, it's bad news, because they're going to be able to enact all of those evil ideas, or at least they're going to harm me much more effectively, right? And I think, and Kant notes this, right? And so this is why he thinks that of all of the possible things that are good, the only thing that is really unqualifiedly good is your will, because what your will is realized, or how it's realized, is all of these other things, but those things also allow really evil wills to be realized more effectively, or something like that. Or in the case of something like joy or happiness, the source of that can be things that are deeply immoral, right? So let's finish with our discussion of the scope of the moral community, and then talk very briefly about Kant as a figure, and then we can just kind of go from there. So we mentioned, and then we can talk about feminist ethics, and then we can talk about our passages from the Red Dead anthology book. So one of the things that I think is a thing that I always think is interesting when I think about ethics and morality is just the moral status of objects, of entities, right? I mean object or entity there in a way that isn't, right, dehumanizing. I just mean all of the things that could exist. What are the moral status of those different things? And on a consequentialist view, or at least a utilitarian view, what we saw is something like sentience, right? That is the old meaning of sentience. Now people use it to mean sapience, and I don't know, use determines meaning. So maybe now it just means this, but right, the idea of sentience originally is just being able to feel pain and pleasure, and sapience is the idea of like that higher order thinking and stuff. And now we just use sentience to mean all of that, but sentience, the minimal view, is the thing that matters on a utilitarian view to be admitted to the moral community. You can be a moral agent, right? That is, I'm not talking with, so I don't have a dog now. I grew up out on a farm, and I grew up out in the country, and we had several outside dogs. We had some outside kind of mousing cats. We had a few inside cats, and we had, I think we at one point had a few chickens and a goat. But when I think about the dogs, right? Because the dogs and cats were the ones that were the most immediate in our lives. I didn't sit down with, my golden retriever and say, hey, let's legislate the moral rules for our community together, right? That would have been a waste of time. It would have been a waste of his time and my time. It wouldn't have gone anywhere. The dog wasn't a moral agent. I also wouldn't punish the dog the way I might punish a human if they did something, right? So the dog chews on the corner of a couch. I might get upset, but then I would probably just try to condition it differently, because it doesn't really understand what it did, doesn't really have moral agency, right? But if a friend came over and they chewed up a corner of the couch, I would first want to know what's wrong with them and what's going on. But I also might say, hey, you know better. Like, you're a full agent. We can talk about this, and there's no way that you should have done that, right? Whereas with a dog or a cat, I just have to go, oh, they don't know what they're doing. I guess I better prevent it or something, right? So it's a difference in the way we treat an entity, a creature. But we still think they have moral status. They're moral patients, right? Using that term we used last time, which is they have moral status. Their interests deserve to be taken seriously in our moral calculus or our moral calculation, even if they are not moral agents and can't involve in this deliberation, right? On a Kantian view, and this comes out in the context of animals in particular, Kant thought that animals don't really have any kind of moral rights. They aren't really part of the moral community, and if they are, it's only indirectly. So Kant thought the reason to not mistreat animals might be because that might just, as a matter of likelihood, condition you to be more likely to treat other people that way. So I don't want to torture the dog because maybe that's going to make it more likely for me to do that kind of thing to a human. That's why it would be bad, not because I've done something to the dog, because the dog doesn't really matter morally. Because on Kant's view, the scope of the moral community is just those individuals which are autonomous and rational and can set their own ends, right? There are people who think that that's really not a consistent application for Kant. So there's a philosopher named Christine Korsgaard who has written a lot of stuff on, she's very broadly speaking a Kantian, has done a lot of work on kind of neo-Kantian ethics, but she's actually written a bunch of stuff that is kind of a Kantian defense of the idea of animal rights, which is very strange because Kant himself seems committed that it doesn't work. And she thinks that's because he's wrong about what some of these principles really commit him to. And that's something I also want to mention is we should always be, I think, comfortable when we're talking about these past figures to think that it's possible they didn't really understand the implication of their own theory or its scope accurately. People can get stuff wrong, right? I get stuff wrong all the time. And it might be that Kant really, his principle should have applied this far and he didn't take it to, right? This is the same way that Shafer-Landau, for example, says that, Kant very clearly seems to be committed to the idea of absolute rules that are exceptionless and can never be broken. But it doesn't seem like anything in Kant's moral theory requires that. It just seems like he accepted it and adopted it, right? Just like with all of the stuff that we're doing, part of what I think we're both looking for you to do as students is to read it and understand it, try to come to an understanding of it. But then I think, you're free to engage with it critically and reject parts of it or say, here's why I don't think Kant's right about this or Mill is right about this or the virtue ethicist is right about this or whatever. So, but we want to understand it first, right? And so on a Kant's view, the moral scope of the community on everyone except basically Korsgaard and maybe Tom Regan, the implication is that animals have no moral status. And unfortunately, and Kant doesn't seem to have appreciated this, or if he did, or later defenders of him, it's hard to make sense of. But this would also mean that human beings that don't possess rationality and autonomy are also not part of the moral community, right? And so when we think about this now, we think about those, again, what Shafer-Landau describes as the marginal cases, which are human beings, but because of developmental disability or brain injury or any other number of possible causes, that they're comatose, that they're whatever, that they don't have the ability to be autonomous, set their own ends, engage in reasoning, right? And I think a straightforward Kantian view would say those individuals are also not members of the moral community. So that's, I think, a real kind of weakness of Kant and of Kantian theory is this scope of the moral community becomes really, really restricted. Let me give a couple of discussion of maybe the attractions and some other problems of Kant's view, and then we can keep going. So why is Kantian ethics attractive? Why is this attractive? Well, if you have a sense of justice, Kantian ethics is pretty attractive to you, right? We talked last time about how consequentialist theories, as much as they might like to, just don't seem to have a central place for something like justice, right? And on Kant's view, that's right up there. It's like right there at the fundamental part. If I treat people unjustly, sorry, that's it, game over, right? On Kant's view, it's intuitive to think that a lot of immorality comes from making exceptions for ourselves, right? So, it is so frustrating when someone does something and they say, but you don't get to do that. Why? Not for any good reason, because I'm special or something like that, right? And that seems like a lot of what happens when people think, I get to bend the moral rules, but not you. Something unfair has occurred. And Kant's view would explain that, right? That their maxim can't be universalized appropriately. I think that the idea that treating other human beings as objects or as means to an end, as sort of something like the root of immorality, I find that just me personally incredibly plausible. I also think that I think that's really intuitive, right? I mean, we talk about people who use other people or who manipulate other people, right? If you just think about this in the context, not of big, airy moral theory, but about your own relationships. If you've ever had a family member, a sibling, a good friend, and you saw them get in a relationship with someone who's taking advantage of them, it burns you up, right? It feels really like something is going wrong there. And not just because that's a person you care about, but because they're being manipulated. They're being treated like an object, right? And so this view of Kant's would explain that kind of intuition, that kind of match. It has that good impartiality that we want. Again, we'll come back to this in feminist ethics because certainly not everyone agrees impartiality is a good thing. But if you're worried about nepotism, I was just reading, who's the daughter of Ethan Hawke? Robin, I think is her name. Maya, thank you. She played Robin in Stranger Things. That's what I'm getting confused about. Yeah, so she recently just came out and basically said, I totally get that I got a lot of roles because of who my parents are, and I'm fine with it. And I think, when people are upset about Nepo babies or in any area of culture, or they're upset about nepotism, what they're upset about is it seems like people are being treated partially without good moral reason, right? And so impartiality is something we at least might want to aspire to. Maybe not, right? But it's at least initially attractive. We want to do more philosophy if we want to figure out whether that's true or not. And again, there are going to be cases where we think, just like the cases we talked about in consequentialism, where maybe I could violate this person's rights really egregiously, but it would be so good for all these other people that I should do it. And something in us, I think, really screams out against that, right? Or at least we have a very strong reaction often to it, that that's not fair, it's not right, it's not just. And a Kantian view would accommodate that kind of moral intuition. So in terms of some of the problems with Kantianism, we've already discussed the scope of the moral community. It seems like that's just, for many people, that's going to be a reason to object to Kant. It's also the case that the notion of someone as an end in himself, it might be kind of vague and not so action guiding. So if you recall, we had that critique about virtue ethics, that it's maybe doesn't actually give you a lot of concrete advice of what to do in a given situation. Same thing would be true in Kantian ethics. The principle of universalizability, while it's interesting, it seems really hard to make work in a way that gives you only moral stuff. This is something that Shafer-Landau talked about kind of at length. But I think anyone who's thought about this a lot has realized that it doesn't seem like, by itself, that doesn't seem like a very good test for a moral principle, that it's just universalizable. Kant seemed to think that formulation and the humanity formulation, to treat people as means, as never as a mere means, but always as an end, as equivalent. But it's hard to see that those things are equivalent. So even if you think the one is really insightful, you might think the other maybe has some issues or problems. And Kant preferred this idea of kind of an eye for an eye, lex talionis, as a justice principle. But that seems, again, there seem to be good reasons to maybe reject that or think it doesn't always work in the right way. And really, that's a broader problem of suppose someone does deserve a thing. Exactly how much do they deserve it? To what extent? Those things are things that are not specified or not spelled out in any kind of Kantian moral theory. So let's talk briefly about Kant, the individual. So Kant was really kind of interesting. He didn't publish any of his groundbreaking work until very late in his life. A lot of the work he did would have been consistent with the kind of German philosophical orientation at the time. An example that you can give, and someone that Kant taught until he read David Hume, was Christian Wolff, W-O-L, I think F-F. And basically Wolff was doing this kind of, broadly, I guess I would say, Christian metaphysics stuff. And so that was really kind of a lot of philosophy, especially in Germany at this time. And Kant, I want to say in his 40s or 50s, Kant was really amazingly punctual. He was from Königsberg. I don't think he ever left Königsberg. And people would talk about how you could set your watch by Kant taking his walks because it was just so regular. It was just so punctual and specific. But he did not really get outside of Königsberg. And at some point he read some of the works of David Hume. And Kant later said, Hume shook me from my dogmatic slumber. And that caused him to basically go, I'm going to come up with this whole new philosophy that's responding to this Humean skepticism and these Humean views on the nature of emotion and reason and morality. Hume's view was that we don't act from reason, we just act from emotion, and then reason just comes in later and kind of does good window dressing to make us feel better about what we're doing or whatever. And Kant did not think that was true, but he also didn't really know how to respond to it, and nothing in the kind of German philosophical background that he had allowed him to. So this is when he wrote The Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals and The Critique of Pure Reason and Practical Reason, and all these things that we now know him for today, is because of Hume, basically, right? And his encounter with Hume, which I think is David Hume, the Scottish historian and philosopher, which I think is really interesting. I think that, it's important, especially in a course like this, and especially given, how much our discussion of history and of the West has talked about race, that we not, ignore the fact that Kant was one of the, he wrote a thing in 1775 called Of the Human Races, or of the Members of the Human Race. It's really a kind of scientific racism, right? It's an early account of scientific racism. I don't remember if Kant was a polygenist. I think Kant was a monogenist, right? Which is, when you're thinking of that early science of race, you had people who thought there were lots of different humans that started out the human race, and that explains their differences. And then there are other people who thought all humans started in one way, like we have this shared common ancestry, but then geographical variation and isolation and other stuff is what led to different races or something like that. I believe Kant was a monogenist, but he certainly did not view women as equals and his ability to have full rationality, and he explicitly also thought that was true of a lot of other racial groups in this, again, kind of scientific racism way. So, one thing that I think is interesting is, we might ask or might think about to what extent it is possible for, Kant to talk about humanity, right, in a way that really seems exceptionless. I mean, the way and this isn't just from our impression, like you can read the stuff that he writes about it, he's writing about human beings in a way that suggests he's talking about all human beings, and that they deserve this kind of respect and they ought to be never treated as mere means. But then, Kant also wrote this stuff that is very clearly racist, right? And so that just seems, on the face of it, inconsistent, right? It doesn't seem like both of those things can be true at the same time. And I think Kant was incredibly intelligent. And so sometimes I think I at least sometimes have this problem of, when I look back on these historical figures, I just think, man, how could you get this so wrong, right? Or Aristotle is another example. I think Aristotle is really, really insightful about a number of things, about human relationships and about moral development and human flourishing. But he also, I think he says that in one of the things he wrote that was more on biology, that like women have fewer teeth in their head than men or something. And it's like, dude, you got a wife. You could check that out. Like, what happened, right? Like that would countenance this of this otherwise incredibly intelligent, thoughtful, sensitive person. And so I think this is something I at least always wonder about when I think about Kant too, is, his explicit views seem to absolutely rule out, explicitly rule out something like slavery, right? I have not read enough of Kant's other writing to know what he says about slavery specifically, but I've read enough about his work on race to know what he thinks about broadly, right? African American, African peoples, Black peoples, Asian peoples, and he seems to think that they're all basically inferior to European peoples or something like that.
And
right?
I think that's a part of that trajectory, right? I think when we think of the Enlightenment, it's the Enlightenment comes, somewhere in the mid 1600s, and so we could do the math in terms of where is Europe in the mid 1600s.
Yeah.
Well, Europe, mid 1600s, you go back 200 years, mid 1400s, that's the moment like Portugal is going down Africa, and then you're almost sending Columbus west. If you go 100 years into the mid 1500s, you have sort of Spanish dominance, Portuguese dominance in different parts of the world. You've already gone around the world. And Europe is, again, it's the literature of the time, the travel literature. And so you're able to read about all these accounts. You're also encountering people that aren't reading or aren't producing accounts of people from all over the world, right? So someone from India is not getting in a boat and going all around the world and meeting all these different people. And so Europe has this sort of, if we have a concept of knowledge, and you know for a fact that India had a concept of knowledge, rich tradition of knowledge, China the same, Africa, like all these places have their own sets of knowledge.
Yeah.
By the time you get into, and this is where the 1600s, you get to the 1600s, the knowledge that counts is the European knowledge. And then you would ask, well, why is that? Well, the European knowledge has a force behind it precisely because of the monopoly of, transoceanic trade and power projection, technological innovations. Not so much yet, but the sheer presence of ships that have, 30 cannons, and you can do certain things that, people from India are not, right? They're not going into the Caribbean and taking over islands. And so the Enlightenment, right, rises amidst this. I've always called them the scribes, right, of modernity, because they're the ones that they get to look at 200 plus years of what the rest of the world looks like. And they're sitting in a position of, a lot more affluence because of that trade, right? It's also the sugar boom. The sugar boom is in the early to mid 1600s. So arguably the sugar boom helps fund Enlightenment thinking in the sense that, hey, you can sit there and write about this stuff and you have all these benefactors. Right? So the evolution of sort of European superiority evolves amidst that. And kind of that knowledge, right? There's a couple of works that talk about, information and knowledge is what set Europeans ahead of other groups, right? They knew the knowledge of the continent, or at least the mapping of it. I think of maps, how valuable maps were.
Yeah, absolutely.
How valuable it was to name places and to make sure that name overrides any other name that used to
any local
be there,
name or whatever.
Right? And so there's definitely this sense of like a godlike. I mean, even think of Cortez. Like they were playing up the idea that they might see us as gods. Like it's sort of like they knew more about the indigenous people than the indigenous people knew about them. And once you have
there's
that
like
leverage,
information asymmetry.
Because you're like, oh, they think this. I know exactly how they think, so we can play this chess game. Until we have a greater, strength in numbers. You get into the 1700s, right? Like it just gets even more. Like if you've ever there's a video called the Slave Trade in 2 Minutes. And it has dots that represent documented voyages of slave ships. In the 1600s it picks up, but when you get into the 1700s, it's just this flood moving across the Atlantic Ocean. And that's when all these writings,
as well as North America.
And so you have ideas of humanity, ideas of freedom. All of these are being constructed when the Atlantic slave system's being, I mean, it's already in place, but it's being strengthened. You have settler colonialism, again, in the United States. Ideas of humanity and freedom are attached to this sort of colonial presence, right? It's the whole, are they settlers or are they invaders? Well, your ability to control knowledge, everyone's going to say settler, right? Or even the idea of Indian, right? The idea that Indians are Indians, but what if you live in India? Well, you're Indian, but the European imposed name of Indian is still a part of Native Americans. Right? That, to me, that's an illustration. It's a godlike kind of act, right?
Yeah.
It's agency on a global level where
Sure.
you're able to stamp.
Yeah.
And so, you know, someone like Kant and, you know, Jefferson, for instance, right, where
Yeah.
he, in the Notes on Virginia, where he does, like, he offers a scientific moment of,
Yeah.
you know, people of African descent are just different.
Yeah.
We don't know what that is. Science will tell us. But the weird thing is he does say, and this is where the Enlightenment part is in him, he says that Native Americans are pretty about the same.
Yeah.
And he even envisioned that our blood's going to mix.
Yeah. He talks
Right.
about this explicitly.
Yeah. And so that to me is a huge difference between Romanticism and the Enlightenment.
Okay.
Where you have Jefferson as the last of the Enlightenment figures, is all the atrocities in that, you know, massive slave owner, all that.
Sure.
But the idea that, you know, there's a huge change between we'll mix with their blood. Their inferiority is
Yeah.
only in culture.
Yeah. Yeah.
To
Yeah.
100 years
I think this
later,
is-
and it's exterminate, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
as the phrase exterminate all brutes, where, okay, that's the solution. We need to exterminate,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. This is actually one of the reasons that Kant mentions preferring a the idea that all of these races are the same human race and started out the same, is that, you know, he noted that obviously people from these different, you know, again, quote unquote racial groups could like interbreed and stuff. And if we were totally different species, that seems like it shouldn't happen, right? In the same way that this is one of the ways that you think in biology about whether two things are different species, can they produce like viable offspring? And if not, probably it's a good reason to think they're different species, right? Yeah, I think this is, you know, a good thing to think about. I think, you know, I didn't mention it initially, but part of Kant's view on autonomy does include this idea of freedom, right? Yeah. And part of that comes from Kant's metaphysics and thinking about the way, you know, Kant makes this distinction between what he calls the noumena, which is the thing in itself, the phenomena, which is the thing as we see it or understand it, the thing perceived by us. And he thought we have to view ourselves in both of those ways. We have to think about what are we like in and of ourselves versus what are we like as we understand them on the basis of human knowledge. And part of the reason he comes to this conclusion about freedom and autonomy is because he does seem to think humans are special than other parts of the world, but our kind of phenomenal understanding of the world, especially at this time, was increasingly like mechanistic, right? And we're rejecting all of that old quasi-Aristotelian science, and now we're thinking about Robert Boyle's gas laws and like all of the kind of corpuscularianism stuff that he thought was true, which is really kind of an old kind of atomism. But then, you know, if we're just like all of those things made up of the same stuff, then we wouldn't have any kind of agency. We wouldn't have any free will because it's just physical laws and pushing and pulling, and that's it, right? And so Kant thought, if we understand them ourselves like noumenally, we have to, given our experience of autonomy and choosing, we have to think of ourselves as free, as absent coercion or something like that, or restriction, in a way that when we're just thinking of people from this phenomenal perspective, from this perspective of what we know about the rest of the world and us as part of it, it's like we can't think of that. And so this is in a lot of Kant's work of like trying to navigate that. It's also why I think autonomy is really prized for him. And this is maybe a good way to segue into feminist ethics, right? Because as the Shafer-Landau chapter on feminist ethics suggests, you know, one reason to think about feminist ethics as an entirely kind of different ethical theory or set of ethical theories or set of concerns is because, you know, well, I mean, historically, most of our all of the ethical theorists we've talked about, at least that are older ones, right? Because we've talked about Philippa Foot, we've talked about G.M. Anscombe and stuff, but a lot of feminist ethicists, you know, started by just the recognition that, you know, historically women have been treated very badly. They have not been extended the same kinds of rights that have been extended to men. They have not been, their concerns and ideas and their intelligence has not been rated as significantly or as highly as people have rated men's significance or intelligence or interests. And so part of the focus of feminist philosophy is really to just say, look, there's 50% of the population whose experiences and voices have been ignored, or who have been kind of treated as second-class citizens, or not even as citizens at all. And there might be some real insight into those experiences and those perspectives to ethics, right? And so a lot of feminist ethics, again, as a broad set of, this is something that Shafer-Landau talks about, is there isn't really a feminist ethical theory in the same way that there's a Kantian theory. Even though there are differences, it's all roughly starting with the same thing. And you have that kind of the same broad brush strokes of a theory, and then people disagree on how to apply it or what particular modification you want to give to it. The same thing is true of consequentialism. There is really, utilitarianism is the most well worked out, coherent single theory that's consequentialist. And, these kind of big systems, and systematizing is something that I think especially like philosophers want to do, and we hope to do. We hope it's doable, right? But a lot of feminist ethical theorizing has not had as much time, right, to occur as a lot of these other sort of ethical theories. And so there isn't really a single ethical theory the way there could be, at least in a certain way, a single Kantian theory or a single utilitarian theory, even really kind of a single virtue theory, although that's a little more varied. But, one of the basic ideas in feminist ethics is this idea that what we want to do is take as our starting point for ethical theorizing maybe the experiences of women. And for a lot of history, those experiences are experiences of care and dependence relationships, right? It's, as you were talking about, the domestic labor, but it's also even sometimes domestic labor that is outside of the family, right? So I'm thinking about, discussion of, whether a person, say, like, let's think about like a rich heterosexual couple at some point. Even if the wife isn't doing a lot of that domestic labor, they probably are paying someone to, and that person is probably a woman, right? So female servant or female laborer or something. So part of the point of feminist ethics is to take seriously those kinds of experiences, women's experiences, insofar as there are commonalities there, and try to figure out like what kinds of sort of lessons and insights we might derive from moral behavior on the basis of those experiences. Shafer-Landau talks about Carol Gilligan's book in a different voice, but one thing he's really talking about in the context of feminist ethics is this idea of an ethics of care. And there are a lot of contemporary feminist ethicists who have adopted that as the way they think about ethics. So Hild Lindemann, I think, is a good example of this. She does a lot of stuff in like bioethics. Or Nell Noddings, who did a lot of stuff in philosophy of education, but also did important work in kind of feminist care ethics more broadly, would be examples of this. But it's really less a single theory and more like a kind of starting set of starting points or assumptions, and then you kind of move into your ethical analysis from there. And so some of these starting points and assumptions are that, women have just as much moral status or just as much moral insight as men, that women are, just as capable of ethical theorizing as men, and that women's experiences and their perspectives are just as valuable as men's. So since a lot of women's experiences have historically been in the context of particular family relations and special relations, and in the context of domestic labor and dependence, there is a lot of, again, connecting back to Kant, there's, I think, usually a rejection of an idea of just sort of too much autonomy or pure autonomy as sort of maybe not valuable, or maybe it's valuable, but it's certainly not the only thing that's valuable. I mean, you could have feminist writers who disagree on this. But one thing that you would think about, right, I mean, if you think about autonomy as independence, which is one way to think about it, but not the only way to think about it, well, a lot of the experiences of women have been of dependence, right, of people depending on them or them depending on other people. And that, you might think, gives you a different kind of insight or experience into kind of moral deliberation and moral decision-making. And, the other thing I think that's really important here is a lot of, and I've certainly been touting this, and I think this is valuable, there's a kind of abstraction and impartiality in the ethical theories of both Kant and the consequentialists. Virtue ethics is less so, right? Virtue ethics takes seriously the idea of these special particular relationships and the idea of particular moral complexity. But in the case of both Kantian theory and consequentialist or utilitarian theory, the focus is really on we want to make this big abstract system that is impartial, that treats people differently for good reason, as we talked about. But if what your model of ethics is, especially for like a feminist care ethics, is particular relationships that you have with family members, well, then you're not maybe going to be focused on, say, asserting my rights to a person, right? Because that's what people who have contracts do. It's not what people who love each other in a family do, right?
Yeah. Do you think too? So I think like abstraction, impartial. Part of the ability to do that, like say, just pick Kant.
Sure. Yeah.
Is that you're speaking from this hilltop of a European view of the world, 1700s, late 1700s, almost to the point of dominance, right? 1800s imperialism, that's really the grip solidifies.
Sure, yeah.
But you're able to be abstract. You're able to create universals when you control what is defined, and especially with autonomy, like autonomy defined as a masculine trait, dependence as a feminine trait.
Sure, yeah.
I'm wondering if these, like for feminist philosophers, you don't argue about autonomy because autonomy has always been against. To start with autonomy is to then you have to reverse engineer something that has for, if not centuries, but thousands of years, been the primary assumption guiding men's domination of women's bodies. And so the idea that you would use autonomy is sort of it's a starting point that has been used against you, so you can't really use it as a starting point.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. That
maybe as a delusion or an illusion of the whole. Like, you can't have an absolute, right? And it can't be impartial because an impartial, absolute, universal abstraction can only exist if the monopoly of acceptable knowledge, which I guess these here are questioning.
Yeah.
If that's undermined, then you can start working in the idea that women are the moral equals of men, right? Women's experiences are different versus the abstract universal of men's experiences. This sort of the opposite of that. Like there's a very much the weight of the narrative. Right, the weight of knowledge is literally forcing feminist philosophers to negotiate this sort of these line items to escape a philosophy that, while it might not be specific, because it's always in the other writings where he's racist, or in the other writings where, but in the writings when you're just talking about abstraction, it's you have to read it with the assumption being European men.
Or you could read it that way. Or I don't think you're required to read it that way.
You would read it that way if you're trying to be historical. If it's written in 1765, and you're to take it as someone writing in 1765, and then putting other writings around it. You would have to accept that they must mean that freedom is only for white men because the writings around them and their moral community are saying that white men are right. It's all men are created equal is not literally all men are created equal. It's white men are created equal. But because you're in that position to dominate knowledge, you can be abstract. So you could say all men are created equal. I mean, you have the power to be vague because you also have the power to enforce the disciplining and narrowing of the community. Right? It's like you can do both. I can be vague and not call out people, but I also have the very material power to ensure that certain people are excluded.
I mean, I guess I'm not sure what to say also, because you kind of asked like three different questions in there. So, I mean, so maybe we'll start just, I guess, maybe with what I think, and then we can then go forward. So, do I think that the only way that you can, for example, develop these abstract, very general kinds of views is if you're in a kind of dominant position? I guess I don't think that that's necessarily true. I think that, for example, that, there are lots of ideas that are abstract and impartial that have nothing to do with human beings, like ideas about mathematics. And I think that while there are, it is certainly true that there were mathematicians who were racist and sexist, and you can find lots of examples of it. I think that, there's also like really important mathematical concepts that were developed from, Arabic societies, for example, that were really important. And that have been incorporated even in the absence of the dominance of those individuals. And I don't think it necessarily has to be just going back to our example of Kant, like white and European. So, for example, competing philosophy for Confucianism and Taoism in ancient China was Moism. And Moism really radically, especially in the context of ancient China, thought that the best way to sort of be ethical was impartial, undifferentiated love for anyone, regardless of their status or attributes, right? Now, Mozi would have been a man. I don't remember enough about Mozi's history to know whether he was particularly powerful. Confucius, for example, had very little power, monetary ability or whatever, right? So I guess I don't think that has to be true as a thesis about like what allows you to theorize in those ways. I certainly think that, I was just playing a part of the game pretty early today where it's the mission, I think, that is right before the one where the guy falls off the cliff and you have to save him, where you go into town with Uncle. And one of the things that Arthur says, Arthur kicks Uncle and says, what are you doing? And Uncle says, thinking. And so as they're walking to the coach, Arthur says, so everybody here is like working and murdering and killing and lying and just like, doing backbreaking labor so you can think? And Uncle's basically like, well, kind of, yeah. And then, of course, there's this recurring joke in Red Dead Redemption about Uncle's lumbago, right? His back pain and how severe it is and how it's kind of used as an excuse often for him not to do stuff. I do think it's true just as a matter of social arrangement that for anyone to engage in any kind of abstract theorizing at all, they have to have the time and the leisure to do that. And I think you only get that in communal contexts where there's enough other people doing other work to keep people fed and to keep animals out of the grain bin and stuff like that, to allow time for someone to do that. And I think that's true whether you're thinking about like religious, theological development of ideas or philosophical development of ideas, or thinking about theories of ethics, is there has to be enough stratification and enough surplus to allow a person to say, this is what I'm going to devote my life to.
Yeah. The Greeks, right?
Yeah, Aristotle thought this explicitly, that the only way that you can have philosophers is if some other people are slaves. Yeah. You don't have to go that extreme. You could just think, if you and I and 12 other people were on an island and we just had to do what we had to do to get by, I don't think either of us would be able to skip by going, well, I'm going to be a historian and I'm going to be a philosopher and we're going to write our notes and you guys do, all the hard work. You'd be like, sorry, get in here and do the work with us, right? Yeah. So I do think that for any kind of theorizing at this level of abstraction, this level of kind of sophistication where you're dedicating your entire life to just coming up with something like this, there has to be enough surplus time and value and labor so that some people are able to do that. And I think, I'm hopeful that this could occur in a way that is like fair, but certainly probably historically a lot of it occurs in a way that isn't very fair, right?
Yeah. And it seems like there's two ways, right? Like, like when I'm teaching U.S. history, founding fathers, words about freedom, good, right? Like, yes.
Yeah.
Deeds bad.
Yeah.
Like,
specifically owners. About slavery and stuff. Yeah, absolutely.
So there's a way to like, yes, these words have been mobilized on behalf of historically marginalized communities to advocate for freedom. So good.
Yes. Yeah.
They were written by settler colonialists and slavers and all that stuff. So bad.
Sure. Yeah.
And that's what we're left with.
Yeah.
Right?
So
you're left with the situation of using sets of language that arose under questionable circumstances.
Yeah. So I guess I would say, and this is, I think, this is maybe another thing that gets at like maybe some methodological difference between historians and philosophers. I think that philosophers mostly are interested in, I mean, like when I have a bunch of anthologies and books about Kant and stuff in my office, right? And most of what people are trying to do is basically figure out, is Kant's moral theory true? And if it is, what does that mean? Like, what does it mean to apply it? And if it's not, or if there's a problem with it, is there a way to repair it? Or is it just like the whole thing's done, right? So in a certain way, I think what philosophers care the most, so I think Alan Wood and Paul Guyer are two of the if you said, here's the 5 top English-speaking Kant scholars in the world, they would be in the top 3 probably, right? Like they're just the best. And I think, that kind of person undoubtedly has a sense of Kant's writings on race, writings on scientific racism and stuff. But I think what they're more interested in is this theory true, and are there good arguments to think about human beings generally this way? And I think that often they're less interested in what did the historical Kant think in addition to this on these other things, right? I think they definitely recognize that, Kant had these views that we think he's just wrong about, that apply to women, that apply to members of different races, right? And so I think and this is what philosophers often are interested in doing, is they try to kind of, it's a common philosophical project to take someone's views and say, so here's some problems with it. Is there any way we can keep the good stuff and get rid of the bad stuff, right? And I think that, I don't think that means philosophers are not interested in moral ambiguity or situations of moral complexity. I think philosophers write and talk and think about those things all the time. I think that at least it is very common for philosophers to be interested in the, I guess I would say intellectual history. So for example, a lot of discussion about Kant's work comes, again in philosophy, comes in the context of he's responding to David Hume, so you got to know what David Hume was saying, and he's departing from this kind of German philosophical tradition. It's exemplified by Christian Wolff. We have Christian Wolff textbooks, so we can know roughly what he was teaching, and so it is very helpful to understand what Kant was doing to put him in kind of conversation with those things. But I think it is not as common for philosophers to, it's not that philosophers, I think, want to ignore race or gender, but I think that most philosophers think most of the explicit theoretical writing don't require any commitment on those issues. And so we can essentially excise those things and still get something really good and interesting as an ethical theory, right? So you don't want to, for example, ignore the fact that Kant wrote these things about race. But I think when you're looking in the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, you're looking in the critique of pure reason, there isn't a lot of explicit mention of that. And just thinking broadly about the whole system, the system doesn't require anything like that, right? Whereas there are, of course, ethical theories and people that were writing stuff that requires a metaphysical difference between white people and black people, or men and women, or something like that, right? And I think I think to some extent this might just be something of a methodological difference. There are philosophers who want, for example, to not really read Hume anymore because of his, he sent a letter. He sent a letter vouching for someone when he knew that person was probably going to basically use a letter of introduction to buy some slaves. So that's something people cite. His remarks on race, on gender, are things people cite to say, we think the entirety of Hume's views are basically infected in this way, and so we don't want to do it. But mostly when people argue that, they don't argue this particular passage in, the treatise on human nature or whatever says this racist thing. They just think it's somehow in there, but it's really hard point to exactly where, or specifically where, or that Hume says this particular thing, right? Again, there are parts where you can see that, but it's usually not in the mainline theoretical works that we use to think about Hume's view on causation or skepticism or ethical theory or the sentimentalism that he's known for. So I think this is very much in line with a kind of, this is, I think, a good feminist critique of someone like Kant, right? Which is Kant's only able to be that general and be that impartial because he kind of has the leisure to and the power and the position to, right? And because he has that power and that position, which I think is what's common among feminist philosophers, both historically and to some extent, lesser extent, contemporary feminist philosophers, you can say, well, of course, someone like Kant or a traditional kind of male ethical theory, if you want to think about it that way, is focused on competition and the free market. And so I've got to secure my rights because this person is going to cheat me in the marketplace, right? Well, those experiences they have there are instructive in how they think about their concepts and think about the world and think about human interaction, right? And I think the point of, many feminist philosophers is to say that is, even if it, aspires to impartiality or aspires to universality or abstraction, is necessarily reflective, they might say, of a more particular viewpoint or something like that. So I think that, this idea of dependence in particular and that partiality of relationships, I think that's really important in a kind of feminist philosophical ethics point of view. And of course, there are, there are feminist philosophers before recent analytic feminist theorists, right? So like Simone de Beauvoir, and you've got a lot of other examples, right? Mary Wollstonecraft and stuff. But I think another thing to think about is, feminist philosophy often puts a really significant role on emotion. So that is consistent with virtue ethics, but notice that that's something that both consequentialists and Kantian theorists either have ignored or relatively diminished in terms of a role for their ethical theory. It's pretty common for care ethics feminists to think about like the mother-child relationship as the central way to sort of get insight. And again, if I think what I'm really doing from a kind of rights-based perspective, say, or even a social contract theory, we didn't talk about this, but this is another thing that he covers as another kind of common contemporary way to think about ethical theory. In a social contract theory, I'm basically agreeing to whatever I can get away with in a certain way, right? And the reason to do it, at least from a Hobbes kind of perspective, Thomas Hobbes, is because if we don't have a contract, people are just going to be mean and nasty to each other, right? Hobbes famously says that the life in the state of nature for a human being would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, right? Because he thinks without this kind of social contract, without the Leviathan, a ruler imposing law, we're just going to be awful to each other, right? As a basic state of our human nature. So if you have that view, it's probably very different than how you develop moral theory, right? If your view is of the marketplace of two individuals who have just as much power and ability and freedom and land ownership possibility, etc., well, then you're interacting with each other differently, right? Whereas if most of my interaction is with people who are in my family or just in my immediate circle of friends or my regular interactions, the model for my moral interaction is probably going to be a little different, right? And so then the things I emphasize and focus on are also going to be different. So I'm going to maybe focus more on cooperation and focus more on, either reconciliation or being conciliatory when I have dilemmas, as opposed to saying, well, it's got to be this way or it's got to be this way or something, right? So there are, of course, a lot of other feminist thinkers who've approached things far beyond ethics. So, Lorraine Code is a good example of a contemporary feminist writer. Helen Longino does Kant studies, but from I think more of a feminist perspective and some philosophy of science. I think Susan Hack is a contemporary logician who I think she's feminist, but I think she doesn't I think that maybe some contemporary feminism is very well argued. But you have Claudia Card, who works in feminist ethics, who did a lot of work on evil and poverty evil, really specifically outside of just theological interpretations of evil, which have dominated a lot of the discussion for a long time. Susan Neiman is a Jewish woman who did a book called Evil in Modern Thought that is really, I think, very interesting and thoughtful as a way to analyze evil, very different than Claudia Card's work. There are, there's feminist epistemology and feminist sort of metaphysics and ontology. There are all sorts of ways that you can take a broadly feminist approach in philosophy. What we had our students read in this chapter is really just the beginning, the introduction of an idea of feminist ethics and how it might differ from some of the ethical theories we've already looked at. You can see in our text where Shafer-Landau identifies some difficulties and problems, and note that this is the same thing that he's done for all of the other things that we're looking at, right? We look at the attractions and strengths of a view, and we also look at the objections to it. And I think my own view about this is I want all of our students to have a sense of all of these kind of a grasp of these broad theoretical outlooks. But I think that at the end of the day, I ultimately think that these are all different ethical theories that you might find some parts of attractive, and you might find reasons to object to some parts. You might accept some more than others, and part of that is navigating your own view, right? I mean, I think both of us really hope that this course challenges you a little bit, not necessarily in a way to make you totally radically change everything you think about all of this stuff, but more just now that you've engaged with this material in history and this material in ethics, hopefully you can use that to kind of inform your own view, right? And see to what extent does my view connect to these things or is in competition with them? To what extent am I a consequentialist, right? Mm-hmm. Or a Kantian or a virtue theorist or a feminist ethics, right? Ethicist.
Yeah. And I think when you're engaging in the game and you're doing things you would never do,
absolutely,
it helps you be self-conscious about thinking about your own in real life.
Absolutely, yeah. One of the things that I think is of great benefit to, like in my own personal life, one of the things that I have found to be of a great benefit of reading philosophy in all sorts of areas is to just have additional kind of frameworks and vocabulary to think about things in a more kind of fine-grained or careful way or systematic way. And certainly I'm, as we've talked about several times, I'm not a historian, but when I read history, what I find so interesting is it provides all of this additional context and information that I didn't know about or I didn't think about or wouldn't think about, right, when I think about it. So I think our goal is kind of, the end point of this is we hope that you have a more, fully fleshed out, realized set of ideas and thoughts about all of the stuff that we're talking about the game, about that period of time, about ethics. I think to end here, maybe we'll get to the other Red Dead stuff another time, but to end here, I think, we just want you want your views to be your own, and you can only do that if you really engage seriously beyond what you already take yourself to know. So, all right, well, I think we're going to save the essay in our Red Dead Redemption anthology for next time. Our fifth podcast, our week 4 podcast, will be a little more kind of holistic, and we'll start that podcast by talking about the John Wills essay on the mundane and the sublime in Red Dead Redemption. So thank you all so much for joining us and spending time with us and listening to us and learning alongside us. I've been and still am Rob Byer.
I'm Dan McClure. We'll see you next time.